Hello again. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am the director of UC Berkeley Social Science Matrix. Today, I am delighted to welcome you to a panel on the brand new book by Armando Lara-Millán called Redistributing the Poor, Jails, Hospitals, and the Crisis of Law and Fiscal Austerity. Today's event is part of our Author Meets Critics series, which features critically engaged discussions about recent books by faculty in UC Berkeley Social Science Division. So for each event, the author discusses the key arguments of their book with fellow scholars with shared research interests from other disciplines. And this event, importantly, is co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Law and Society and is part of their regular seminar series. Now, before we begin, I'll just mention a few of our upcoming events. This Thursday, the 22nd, we have a Matrix On Point event titled Truth and Denial, Searching for Information in the Digital Era, with panelists like Kevin Rouge from the New York Times discussing how misinformation spreads online. On May 7th, we have a Matrix Book Salon with Lafleur Stephens-Dugan discussing her book, Race to the Bottom, How Racial Appeals Work in American Politics. And on May 14th, we will have a Matrix On Point event titled America's Pursuit of Racial Justice, where panelists will discuss the critical momentum of Black-led protests and the Black Lives Matter movement over the past year. Now, since today's event is part of the Center for the Study of Law and Society seminar series, you can also find their list of upcoming events, which should appear momentarily in your chat. Now, without further ado, let me introduce the moderator. Katie, yes, we can see you. Hello, Katie. So
Hi.
Katie Alviston is our moderator today. She's the faculty director at the Center for the Study of Law and Society at UC Berkeley School of Law. She's an interdisciplinary scholar engaged in the empirical study of law and society and interested in the relationship between law and social change. There are too many papers to mention, but I'll mention her book, Institutional Inequality and the Mobilization of the Family and Medical Leave Act, Rights on Leave. And the book explores how rights to family and medical leave both challenge and recreate inequality in the courts and in the workplace. Katie has been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and she served on the board of trustees of the Law and Society Association. So thank you very much, Katie, for moderating today's event, and I will let you take it from here. Thank you so much for what promises to be a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Marianne. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our author and two panelists. So let me begin with Armando Lara-Millán, who is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at UC Berkeley. He is an ethnographer and historical sociologist who studies how powerful organizations shape the life fortunes of large numbers of people. He examines the knowledge production that organizations undertake, how they generate truths and rationalize problems and distribute resources. He has undertaken research in a number of contexts, including law, medicine, criminal justice, economic pricing, and urban poverty governance. His work has appeared in American Sociological Review, Criminology, in the volume The Many Hands of the State, and in a forthcoming book with Oxford University Press. He is also the recipient of awards from the National Science Foundation, Law and Society Association, the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, the Ford Foundation, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the American Sociological Association. Okay, so that is, Armando will take over in a minute. Angèle Christin is one of our commentators. She is assistant professor in the Department of Communication and affiliated faculty in the Sociology Department and program in Science, Technology, and Society at Stanford University. She studies how algorithms and analytics transform professional values, expertise, and work practices. Her book, Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms, which was published by Princeton University Press this past year, 2020, focuses on the case of web journalism, analyzing the growing importance of audience data in web newsrooms in the US and France. Her new project examines the paradoxes of algorithmic labor through a study of influencers and and influencer marketing on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And then our second panelist or second commentator today is Jonathan Simon, who is professor at Berkeley Law and teaches in the area of criminal law, criminal procedure, criminology, legal studies, and sociology of law. He's also my colleague over there. Simon's scholarship concerns the role of crime and criminal justice in governing contemporary society's risk in the law and the history of the interdisciplinary study of law. His published works includes over 70 articles and book chapters and 3 single-authored monographs, including Poor Discipline, Parole, and the Social Control of the Underclass, Governing Through Crime, How War on Crime Transformed American Democracy and Created a Culture of Fear, and Mass Incarceration on Trial, A Remarkable Court Decision, and the Future of Prisons in America. So I will turn it over to you, Armando, and then we will move to our 2 panelists. Go ahead, Armando.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. I'm so grateful to everyone who made the time to be here. I know there's a lot going on in the world these days, and all our time and energy is precious. Some of our most recent news these days have hit me like deja vu. The killing of yet more black and brown bodies in the Midwest, the crisis of unaccompanied minors at the border has now returned under a third president. And of course, the pandemic sweeping through our nation's jails and public hospitals. Much has been written about the human suffering that goes along with these events. Civil rights organizations, journalists, and other advocacy groups have meticulously documented the extensive patterns of neglect and abuse within these institutions that govern these problems. The administrators of these problems, however, see them very differently. For them, they're about making sure the right people are placed into the right slots, that the violent are kept away from the less violent, or the sicker are treated before the less sick. If they can do this, then on average, supposedly there will be less suffering on average. Today, I want to encourage us to think about the institutions that govern these problems less as institutions of poverty governance and more as public institutions fighting for resiliency. If we can do this, it is my belief that we can better explain some of this feeling of deja vu. The particular problem that my book takes on is the expansion of medicine in large urban jails and its restriction in large public hospitals during the past 30 years or so. And I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully it works. Can you guys see that okay? Cool. Good. So what do I mean by this? Well, consider the following 2 scenes taken from field work I conducted for a year in 2 such institutions. On one particularly crowded night in a jail, a sheriff's deputy said something that stuck with me. Thank God for the nurses. The young deputy I was shadowing made this offhand remark with a chuckle. After what had just occurred, it must have seemed like stating the obvious. The deputy had been called over to attend to an inmate who was huddled in the corner of a fishbowl, a room surrounded by plexiglass where a dozen or so inmates await transfer into a bed of the sprawling jail. When the deputy attempted to jostle the inmate lightly on the shoulder, the inmate reacted violently, swinging his arms and screaming, "Just leave me alone." The deputy immediately pinned him to the ground. Shortly after, a nurse responded to the situation. As I'd seen her do before, she quickly administered a sedative. Eventually, the inmate calmed down and was carried out of the room. As with hundreds of other inmates on a nightly basis, this inmate would be given a bed in the mental health unit of the jail. Highly prized by inmates, extremely expensive from a budgetary standpoint, and very scarce from an organizational one. On a different night, I observed another provision of healthcare, but this time in an ER of a nearby public hospital. I watched a triage nurse administering another kind of pharmaceutical, opioid pain medication, to a waiting patient who had come to the ER complaining about general abdominal pain. The patient had been waiting for 4 hours and was among many in the observation room of the triage unit, a room packed with patients who were all qualified to receive a bed, but had to wait because of overcrowding. An hour or so later, the patient was called by the nurse to receive a recheck of their vital signs. Indeed, the patient's heart rate had slowed and she reported feeling a bit better. The nurse looked at me, "Watch, they're going to leave." I was not sure what the nurse meant, so when the patient indeed left an hour later, I asked the nurse how they knew. Left the ER, that is. "A lot of people are in here when they shouldn't be, just looking to get drugs or whatever," the nurse said. "Things are really crowded in here, so it's fine." These are just 2 of the many instances that characterize the field work I conducted for a year in the large urban jail and large public hospital. In the jail, the ubiquity of medicine as a form of knowledge and technology to understand inmates and run the jail smoothly. In the hospital, the ubiquity of criminal suspicion to understand patients and make tough choices about who should receive very scarce hospital beds. In the jail, nurses, doctors, therapists, psychotropic drugs, sedatives, mental health evaluation forms all sprang into action whenever there was a disruption to the normal routine of jailing. When the young deputy told me he was grateful for the nurses, it was because he did not have to choose whether or not to use more severe force on this inmate, which put him at legal and employment risk. In the hospital, the triage nurse described the situation as fine because during the year I spent there, the ubiquity of criminal stigma was all around us. These findings make sense given broader trends in America's largest urban jails and hospitals. In 2010, roughly 65% of incarcerated adults in prison or jails met the medical criteria for mental health disorders, 7 times likelier than individuals in the community. Another estimate puts this at 20% of those in jail with serious mental illness. The restriction of medicine in public hospitals also makes sense given their well-known capacity declines. In 1983, we had around 1,600 public hospitals, but by 2003, fewer than 60% remained. 20% had closed, another 20% had been converted to private institutions. Whenever this topic is raised, some version of the following idea is invoked, that because we as a society have disinvested in public health, particularly mental health institutions in the 1960s, the sick and poor are now finding themselves within the purview of the criminal justice system. The idea actually rests on 3 related but distinct theories about our largest public institutions: the theories of deinstitutionalization, retrenchment, criminalization, and mass imprisonment. Indeed, between 1950 and 2000, the number of people with serious mental illness living in psychiatric institutions dropped by from 500,000 to 50,000. This is the deinstitutionalization thesis, that because of society's failure to provide adequate traditional healthcare, housing, and support outside of institutions, persons who end up arrested are now sicker than they used to be. A key problem with this thesis is that it doesn't explain administrators' willingness to provide healthcare resources in jail. The closure of mental health institutions in the 60s doesn't explain why healthcare resources inside of jails in any form, whether they be therapeutic services, healthcare personnel, hospital beds, or psychiatric services, now make up large portions of jail budgets. For instance, DC's jail system spent a quarter of its budget on healthcare in 2012. Chicago's healthcare department spent $100 million for jail healthcare, which is in 2016, which is in addition to the Department of Corrections' own $300 million health budget. New York City's jail spending on healthcare per inmate grew by 175% in the past 10 years. These figures are actually pretty notoriously difficult to capture. We can indirectly measure them through staffing levels. In the 2 years where such statistics exist in the jail census, the only 2 years, healthcare workers in the largest systems grew from around 2,000 personnel in '88 to around 4,000 in 1999, about 10 years. To think that such resources are related solely to the number of people who suffer mental illness in jails would be naive. Why not simply let the mentally ill languish untreated in jails? These numbers relate to the willingness of jail administrators to pay the salaries of medical professionals, to pay for mental health treatment areas that must be accredited, and to invest in continued diagnosis of individuals. The deinstitutionalization thesis is usually linked to what we can call the continued retrenchment, criminalization of social welfare institutions. Scholars point to 2 developments: the application of market rationality to public institutions and the racialization of public spending. Concerning the latter, the idea is that both national political parties took advantage of popular fears concerning the civil rights movement, urban riots, and its perceived and public spending's perceived favoritism towards the urban poor and people of color. This has been linked to crime control techniques in what remains of public institutions. The best known examples are the use of policing techniques in urban public schools and welfare offices. While it might be tempting to apply this argument to public hospitals, the empirical story of spending on public health care is actually quite different, quite the opposite. From 1992 to 2000, national and state expenditures on Medicaid nearly tripled, rising from 116 to 339 billion, a 90% increase in inflation-adjusted dollars. This holds true even for controlling with increasing prices. The increases even squared with rising need. Medicaid spending per person in 2008 constant dollars nearly doubled from 4,000 to 8,000. Astonishingly, these spending increases occurred exactly at the same time as public hospital capacity declines. mechanisms were created to help funnel public money into urban safety net hospitals. Aside from mandating that all emergency rooms accept patients regardless of their ability to pay, in 1981, Ronald Reagan allowed Medicaid funding to take into account the heavy share that safety net hospitals took in providing uncompensated care. Through various mechanisms, the disproportionate share hospital funding and 115 waiver programs, states creatively used such programs to funnel dollars into their largest public hospitals, even when those hospitals were not in the most fiscal need. Over time, 115 hospitals represented by the National Association of Public Hospitals became highly dependent on federal funds to keep their hospitals afloat. This is a story of resilience in public hospital funding in spite of major efforts to dismantle them. The deinstitutionalization and retrenchment criminalizations have been paired with what we know as mass imprisonment. The idea is that because we funneled so much money there in criminal justice, this is where the poor need to go to access social services. However, it may be surprising to hear that the jail systems in America's largest cities stopped expanding in the early 1990s and have been suffering from retrenchment ever since. The proposition that retrenchment has affected carceral systems is a surprising claim given the vast majority of scholarship conceptualizes the CJ system as an ever-expanding institution with limitless capacity to incarcerate. In reality, since the early 1990s, the nation's largest system stopped expanding, and jurisdictions have been developed inmate decompression methods to grapple with retrenchment. It's most poignant in the jails that inform the public imagination on jails, LA, New York, and Chicago. After exploding in the 1980s, populations flattened in the 1990s, having oscillated since, adding or subtracted 1,000 inmates annually, depending on the annual budget. The oscillation belies longer-term declines. LA fell from 2,400 to 14,000, 24,000 to 14,000. New York from 20,000 to 9,000, and Cook County from 10,000 to 6. Along with this also holds true, but at different points for other big cities in Texas, the California Bay Area, and a few other and major southern cities. In total, while these three related but distinct theses create important backdrops to the expansion of medicine in jails and its restriction in public hospitals, they can't fully account for important countervailing trends. So it's often the case, I want to talk about for a quick second about the method I use, but it's often the case that in the place of actual histories of field sites, ethnographers of poverty governance institutions make use of broad theories like deinstitutionalization, welfare retrenchment, and mass imprisonment to explain the origins of what they found. The alternative this book proposes to tie our ethnographic puzzles to archival history. I call this method historical embedded ethnography. While I discuss my methods in greater detail in the book, this is exactly what I did. I embedded what I found in my observations at these two confidential institutions into the archival history of LA County. The history is perfect because the LA County jails and public hospitals transformed in just the ways I was curious about. During the 1980s, the county's jail system would be characterized as intent on jailing as many people as possible and denying them healthcare resources at all costs. They ignored at least 5 different health citations. But by the late 1990s, the jail system was utterly declining in capacity, relying on permanent early release and becoming defined by medicine, with entire wings of jails transformed into medicalized space. The two trends came together in 2015, historic vote to downsize the downtown jail, rebuild it as a correctional health treatment center, fully staffed with medical professionals, implemented an unprecedented diversion program that sent inmates with histories of mental illness or substance abuse into the community supervision. Conversely, despite immense fiscal pressure, its public hospital system received a huge infusion of public funds that helped it to stabilize. While the new funding helped to build new public hospitals and kept 2 from being privatized, all were downsized to dangerous levels in the process. The story of persistence but restricting access crystallized in 2008 opening of the LA County USC Medical Center. The facility cost the county billions of dollars in revenue and was a significant commitment to community health, but had been downsized to only 600 beds, far below the determined community need of 750. We can use, these are the LA County Board of Supervisors here, the group that I studied in primarily in the archives. You can see them grilling the sheriff's officials there in an open meeting. We can use this theory to formulate a new theory. We can use this history to formulate a new theory to explain the puzzle I'm interested in. It's a confluence of austerity and legal demand that creates conditions for institutional transformation. As we shall see, as I show, state officials confronted ever-decreasing resources at the exact same time that new legal rules forced them to expand access, provide more services, and enforce rules that had been neglected. We've already seen how budget retrenchment affected jail sizes, but the problem of austerity runs much deeper. No deliberation on urban poverty governance in the United States can move forward without addressing the limits of city resources. In contrast to European nation states, the drive to gut public budgets in the US has trickled down to the local municipality. Close to 300 of them are currently in default on their debt. Alongside the limits of fiscal resources, what's lost in many analysis of poverty governance institutions is what legal historians and political scientists call the judicialization of American politics. A large share of policy questions have become judicial questions, answered not through political party representation, grassroots mobilization, or coalition building, but through litigation. Special interest groups often feel that litigation is their only viable option to obtain policy goals. Moreover, politicians are often relieved to have such thorny issues settled in courts. What happens when officials are forced by legal imperatives to expand programs during a budget shortfall? I developed the concept of redistributing the poor to illustrate how state agencies resolve this tension. The idea describes how state agencies circulate people between different institutional spaces in order to raise revenue and project illusions that service has been rendered in legally adequate ways. Redistributing unfolds through three processes. First, state agencies work to reclassify the people they're in charge of. This means public officials will re-articulate the kinds of interventions that their wards are thought to require, for instance, emphasizing the mental health needs of a jail population over their security risks. Second, this reclassification allows the movement of such wards into different spaces or changing the kinds of interventions those spaces are thought to provide. By doing so, they can make claims on revenue from other state agencies, both those horizontally located, for instance, such as a mental health department providing services and revenue to a jail, and those vertically located, such as a jail pulling in revenue from state health tax or renting space to state and federal agencies. Third, it is a continuous movement between old space and repurposed institutional space that projects an illusion that service has been legally rendered in a legally adequate way. Literally, the movement of people becomes the legal signal of resolution. The result is not a coherent population management in which the movement of people between state agencies is rationally coordinated for the purposes of punishing, healing, or socially controlling. Instead, the exchange of people is a product of distinct agencies acting alone, often in conflict with other state agencies over which one will have responsibility for different categories of people and the public revenue attached to them. These are moments of statecraft in which the poor are legally and technically provided with a service, but their needs have been re-articulated in a different kind of need that produces revenue for the state or more conservative budgeting. This can help us better understand the expansion of medicine in jails and its restriction in public hospitals. Because the legal pressure oriented jails towards decompression, this structured the kinds of redistributions jail officials could pursue. County officials shifted from thinking about their inmate population primarily as violent gang members to thinking about them as mentally ill, substance abusers, and less criminally threatening homeless persons. Doing so allowed them to funnel in new forms of revenue into their jails from state and federal agencies while also rationalizing the release of thousands of inmates. The character of legal pressure in the hospital system, oriented toward keeping hospital beds open as opposed to decompression, also structured the kind of redistributions that were available to hospital officials. County officials shifted from thinking about their patient population as the urgently sick inpatients to thinking about them as outpatients, homeless persons, and immigrants who were all less seriously sick. Doing so allowed county officials to obtain revenue from the federal government, while also rationalizing the delay of patients in extremely long wait times. County officials worked with regulatory bodies to develop waiting management techniques to handle subsequent overcrowding, such as police units and intake centers, closer observation of waiting patients, and opioid medication that helped waiting patients temporarily feel better during their long waits. These all appear to us as regressive efforts to restrict access to medicine. In total, jails have moved to expand medicine not only because they're seeing mentally ill arrestees, but because reorganizing their jails along these lines has allowed them to tap into new revenue and new means of abdicating responsibility. Likewise, public hospitals moved to restrict access to medicine, not simply due to cutbacks and criminalization, but because doing so allowed them to generate revenue from new sources and to rationalize extremely wait times. In all of these developments, the force of law is indistinguishable from the force of austerity. In total, any explanation that attempts to explain the transformation of public institutions must consider how legal advocates make claims on local governments in the midst of immense budgetary cutbacks. Such governments cannot, at least publicly, simply abdicate their responsibility for the poor and those in need of services. Redistributing the Poor focuses our attention to the circulation of bodies and the types of people that appears to us as increases in public spending. At times, an agency might suffer from budget shortfall and because of legal requirements seek to find a way to draw in revenue from other places to provide its services or sending part of its caseload to other agencies, which would represent funding increases to that other agency. While the transformation studied in this book are examples of institution building during crisis, they nonetheless resulted in the shrouding of human suffering. In essence, because welfare state spending changes the needs of caseloads and re-articulates legal demands to fit those needs, those new needs, the social suffering associated with the original crisis becomes what I call administratively disappeared. The people and problems associated with a specific crisis of fiscal and legal and the law, fiscal austerity and the law, are erased from officials' descriptions and are most often turned into some other new kind of problem. In the United States, this disappearing act is only possible because of racism, but it does not only affect people of color. And I mean this in two respects. First, states only have creative possibilities for redistribution because of the existence of racially and gendered thinking about the kinds of people under their charge. Second, redistributions are only possible because the public is willing to tolerate the premature death of brown and black bodies. If we understand these caseloads as primarily made up of white people, or perhaps if we acknowledge that the many poor white people that do in fact make up these caseloads, the disappearing of suffering would be intolerable. Groups would not be reduced to making legal demands in courts, and the crisis would be treated as if it affected all. That is, the crisis would be treated as the real crisis of humanity that it is. This is what Ruth Gilmore called the disposability of impoverished people of color, how it becomes normalized. These are instances when, despite expansions of public spending, the social suffering of huge swaths of people are simply written off on paper as successful policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Armando. So now I'm going to turn it over to Angel. You have about 10 minutes.
Great. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to be a respondent on Armando Lara-Millán's book. So first, because we haven't seen it yet, I'm going to do a short kind of commercial here. And just say that this is an amazing book, and it's also a beautiful book, and it's a heartbreaking book, and it's all of the above. And I was just so thrilled to get a chance to read it. So let me tell you a tiny bit about myself. So I'm an ethnographer. I mostly study very, shall we say, I mean, now it feels superficial in comparison, but, you know, journalism and influencers, etc. But in parallel, I've also been looking at criminal sentencing and criminal courts for on and off for the past 15 years, first in the French context and more recently in the United States for the past 5 years. I've been doing ethnographic fieldwork on the role of predictive technologies, namely risk assessment tools in criminal courts in different places in the US. And so I was, I guess the word is horrified to find in Armando's book many of the risk assessment tools that I've been seeing in different criminal procedures in different criminal courts over the past 5 years. And so that's where I think some of my questions will come from. So let me start by emphasizing how important this book is. Going against conventional wisdom about the retrenchment criminalization thesis, which I feel we hear over and over again in media coverage, in academic coverage about like what's going on with kind of mass incarceration and kind of the provision of public health care in the United States. Armando Lara-Millán provides a different angle on the question of incarceration and healthcare, showing that the administrative logic and the administrative constraints at stakes in making decisions about poor brown and black people in hospitals and jails are in fact shaping a lot of the decisions and the kind of constant shuffling that we see. Drawing on comparative fieldwork in county jails and emergency rooms, as well as a deep historical dives that I think works really well with the ethnographic fieldwork, he shows that both sets of administrations are basically trying to manage a double and impossible set of constraints. On the one hand, budgetary constraints, right? That there is never enough money to accommodate all clients, I guess. But also small pockets of monies that can be captured by moving strategically, right, and developing in specific ways. So that's the first one. And second, legal constraints, which is that all of these institutions are basically terrified of litigation and public backlash, and are trying to kind of satisfies, I guess, to use an economic language, but are trying to like protect themselves against this kind of litigation effort and this public backlash by kind of, shall we say, raising the bottom line in several ways. As a result, what Armando Lara-Millán shows is that both jails and ERs basically enforce a stratified system based on triage and risk assessment, in which the provision of care and incarceration kind of provisions is very much depends on assessments of medical risk and criminal risk. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, public hospitals and jails are very different, but they end up implementing these logics in ways that are both different but have important similarities. And these similarities come with dramatic consequences for the people who seek care. He shows that poor people are being redistributed constantly between jails and hospitals, kind of shuffled back and forth between two sets of institutions that are overlapping and becoming in a way increasingly similar, or perhaps hybrid is the word I'm looking for. And that this kind of administrative nightmare comes with a way of dealing with these intractable social issues that satisfies no one while dealing with no issue in a convincing way, right? For these reasons, Redistributing the Poor is, I think, an essential book for readers interested in the transformations of punishment and care in the United States. And I think that it's really an important and modern addition to a great lineage of books that shows this kind of exhausting discriminatory shuffling of poor Black and brown people and the transformations of governmentality, shall we say, that comes with it. And here, obviously, I'm thinking of Jonathan Simon's Poor Discipline, Isa Kohler-Hossmann's Misdemeanorland. And I think that Armando's book really kind of comes as one kind of additional brick, I mean, a beautiful brick, but, you know, an important brick in this kind of lineage of books. Now, as a reader, I could stop here, but as a discussant and someone who has studied related questions, I have kind of three questions that I would love to hear Armando talk about. And I wish we could do this around a cup of coffee or, you know, something like that, but it will come in its time, I hope. So first question, unsurprisingly, is about the role of risk and risk assessment technologies in the larger process identified by Armando. So I had an aha moment on page 30 in the book when I saw a good old friend, North Point, being mentioned in the text. North Point now Equivant is a company that builds software programs that are called risk assessment tools. And their main tools is Compass for correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions. And it's one of the risk assessment tools that is being used in jails, but also now in criminal courts as a kind of way of assessing quantitatively the risk of recidivism or the kind of overall criminal risks and the risk of violence. I mean, they measure a lot of different things, but kind of predictive technologies that assess the future risk of offenders or incarcerated people based on a large kind of data analysis that then goes into building the decision tree that they draw upon. What's interesting about this tool, well, lots of things, but first it started as a jail and a custody kind of classification system before spreading throughout the criminal justice system. And so that's where I ended up seeing it in, for example, pretrial departments and criminal courts, and really basically everywhere, right? It has that and other tools that are a bit like it have been very successful in kind of conquering that market for risk. But interestingly as well, this specific tool, Compass, provided by North Point, is right now at the center of a major debate in computer science and critical algorithm study about bias and discrimination in predictive technologies. You may have seen in 2016 an article by Julia Engwin and several of her colleagues at ProPublica called Machine Bias, showing how Compass, during the quantitative analysis of Compass, and showing how it's basically discriminating against Blacks and being much tougher on Black people compared to white people. And the long and the short of it is that there have been 1,000 studies about that tool, and they show that there is no good way of unbiasing it, in part because it draws on historical data, and that historical data has these kind of patterns of discrimination against Black people because of the history of mass incarceration that Armando has mentioned. So anyway, it's like a giant kind of trash fire is kind of how I think about this. And computer scientists are up in arms about what should we do about risk assessment tools. Now, what was striking in Armando's study is that I saw the same tool. So I'm not sure it's the same tool because Armando, you anonymized it. And so, there would be a much longer discussion there, but, I would be curious to know why you anonymized that specific tool and if that had anything to do with the kind of access that you got to county jails, or if it just like didn't come up that way. But it seemed like many of the assessment officials that you looked at were using a very similar tool, if not that specific one, to Compass, right? And so for me, what was striking is how this specific technology was in a way operationalizing and implementing the very kind of categories that you're talking about. For example, you're showing how a lot of incarcerated people are reclassified as medium risk instead of high risk, kind of tweaking the tool, right? And as a way to kind of basically triage them into and not have everybody compete for the same cells, right? And the same kind of mental health services. And so here, what was striking to me is that, in the book, you mostly emphasize the role of administrative logics. And for sure, there is a clear kind of administrative and economic set of constraints here, right? Because they just have X number of beds. And so they're just trying to like shuffle people around so that, they give the beds to the people who deserve it more because they're in the right kind of risk category, etc. But here, I would kind of like to go all Latourian on you. And I feel entitled to do that because you do kind of draw on Latour quite a bit, and ask about, don't you think that in a way the technology here plays a more important role than kind of what you talk about in the role, in the sense that it seems to me that here risk assessment tools are basically the one kind of set of tools that have kind of reconfigured this whole system of administrative logics and classification systems around these questions of medium and high risk. So to put it differently, without risk assessment tools, we wouldn't have these categories of medium and high risk, right? And so, yeah, sure, these categories help solve administrative constraints, but they're also very much enabled and enforced through kind of technological software. So, that would be a first set of questions. Along the same wave, and I'm rushing a bit because I have so many questions. I'm very excited. Recent work, including Julia Engwin's kind of paper and a lot of the work in computer science recently, shows that risk assessment tools themselves are biased, right? And basically provide tougher kind of risk scores and tougher classification on Black people and brown people compared to white people. And so here, I think that, there is a layer here that's really interesting, which is that not only do these technologies and the categories of risks that come with it participate in redistributing the poor, it also keeps Black and brown people at the bottom, right? In a way, in kind of ways that in situations that may be even worse than if they hadn't been classified by the tool due to this kind of discriminatory aspect of risk assessment instruments. So anyway, so there is like a whole discussions to be had here. And I think that your book shows so well the ways in which these categories of risk are put into use and basically inscribed within a broader constraint of administrative kind of logics. And so just kind of pushing you a tiny bit more on the kind of technology side, which is a classical STS move. And so I apologize for that. It's always what STS people do. Okay, the second question is about the language of austerity, which I think does quite a bit of work in your book. And here, paraphrasing Bourdieu, so Bourdieu wrote that use is just a word, right? And I would like to kind of add that like austerity similarly is just a word. So what is behind this kind of language of austerity, right? For the past 30 years, we've been hearing about austerity relentlessly. And I think that you show really well that the ways in which this language of austerity has ramification on the ground. But I was wondering, like kind of at the, going back to the source of austerity, so to speak, what are the concrete political decisions that shape shall we say, decisions about budgets, and what kind of budgetary kind of amounts are assigned to public hospitals versus jails, and why are they changing over time? And so here, I have this basically kind of theory in my head, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. Which is, as you showed this very striking graph showing that like budgets for incarceration have been diminishing since the 90s in major cities, right? Which is just like so counterintuitive. And yet, like, when you look up close, like so important and kind of changes how we think about it. So basically, at this point, the problem of mass incarceration is that it's a hot potato, or to put it differently, it's a rotten potato that no one wants to deal with, right? No one wants to put the money to deal with it, but no one wants to release people in a way, because there is always a risk that could be politically costly, right? And so that basically all kind of administrators are stuck in this kind of no man's land of like not really having the resources, not wanting to deal with it, municipalities not wanting to seem kind of that they're investing in mass incarceration, but yet there is still this huge apparatus that needs to be maintained, right? And so how do you deal with that? And so, I think that here, that's one of the reasons, for example, why risk assessment tools are so important, is that you can externalize some of the pressure to technology and kind of say, well, the algorithms is making decisions about who's risky or not. And that works both, I think, in the healthcare context and the kind of jail context, right? It's like, oh, the algorithm does it. It's not me, it's no one. Like, no one's responsible if someone's released and then ends up committing some kind of violent offense. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what are the logics driving the kind of diminution of budget, for example, for the kind of jails that you're studying, right? And kind of what are the concrete political decisions that shape the allocation of budgets, both for public hospitals and for jails. So my third and last question, and I'll go very fast, is about the opioid crisis. And as a non-specialist, I was really struck both in the kind of criminal justice part and in the hospital part about the role of opioids, a bit like risk assessment tools, again, in solving a concrete set of constraints that, people on the ground, so in the ER and in jail, deal with when they're trying to shuffle people around, right? And so, from their perspective, it's one way to manage poor population compared to police force, right? But then it created, obviously, a major health crisis. And so here you see a kind of eternal cycle, right? Which again, really reminded me of Jonathan Simon's work, where like one set of like short-term solutions for dealing with poor Black and brown people and kind of satisfying or, handling the crisis, then creates an even bigger crisis. And so, in that view, it's not so much about disappearing the crisis, which is something that you talk quite a bit about in the book, but more about throwing the hot potato to the next set of administrators in a way. And so I was wondering if you could talk a tiny bit about that, and especially about the temporalities at stake in what you studied between like short-term small solutions and kind of medium-term or long-term problems that are emerging from these short-term solutions. I'll stop here, but I just wanted to reiterate how excited I am about the book, which I think is really kind of inscribing, like just giving us so much to think about. And from my mother's perspective, given that these days I spend a lot of time with computer scientists talking about algorithmic racism and algorithmic bias in criminal justice without having ever set foot in a criminal justice institution, I'm planning to recommend your book and assign it to as many people as I can on the kind of computer science and algorithm side of things, because I think that this is such a kind of fine-grained and kind of compelling analysis of what happens on the ground in these different sets of institutions that are engaged in the complex process of redistributing the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeli. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much. And now that's a great segue into Jonathan Simon.
Hey, everybody. Thank you both to the Matrix and the Center for putting on this really important book event and for including me in it. And I've learned a lot already. And like Angel, I've responded to this book in so many ways that I won't try to lay them all out now. I'm just going to touch on some things that maybe will spark discussion. The first thing I want to say is that, like many of you, my mind today is partly on Minneapolis and the trial there, the ongoing anguishing experience of seeing Black and brown lives extinguished in front of our eyes in ways that are tremendously damaging to any claim of equal dignity in our society. And I just want to highlight that while that's as deserving as it could be of your attention, so I would argue is this administrative disappearing of public suffering that is so powerfully discussed in this book. And if Black and brown lives are to matter, it's just as important to sort of pull the lid off of this ruse of redistributing the poor, which is really a form of slow death for people, right? It's in Ruthie's sense. They may not die in front of us on camera or in the emergency room, but their lives are being whittled away, and the pain that it comes across made me, want some of those opioids, or at least see the purpose of handing them out in the emergency room. So one question I have for you, just to throw it out right now, is what do you see as the relationship between sort of spectacular moments of state violence and these deliberately more hidden, in fact, deliberate disappearing of mass public suffering? How do they relate to each other? Now, this is a book that, in my view, truly leaps out of its subfield or subfields and deserves to be read across the social sciences generally, because it raises to me some really troubling issues that I take very personally, because I see myself as having participated in them. And that is, you might call it social science as myth making. I mean, we like to view social science as myth destroying, but it also creates its own myths that help to narrate what has happened in society in ways that may be emancipatory for some purposes, but are also disabling and disempowering in others. So just think about some of those of us who have engaged, since I wrote Poor Discipline, right? The social control of the underclass, right? For whom the criminal system, the mental health system are always ways of governing the poor, of controlling the poor. And behind that is this weird, ironically, I guess, reassuring myth of this all-powerful state that's actually capable of doing all these things, and maybe doesn't share our moral values, but it doesn't lack for capacity. But actually, the state is in so many ways not that state, right? So think about mass incarceration. I'm the last person to call mass incarceration a myth, but there are ways in which it was a Potemkin village, right? So if you compare that chart that Armando shows of the LA County jail population and the Chicago and New York County jails to, say, California's incarceration numbers as a state, those keep going up until they go down. They form this perfect sort of arc that tells us this story we already know about, which is this rise of criminalization as this tool for governing the poor and the end of welfare, the end of healthcare. And of course, that turns out to be very untrue in many respects. And when you look at LA County, we see a system as engaged in moving prisoners out as moving them in, and that image of a steady state prisoner population always going up until it had to go down was actually a product of these manipulations that allowed that image to maintain itself, allowed the state not to have to let any prisoners officially go. I think we've already talked quite a bit about the deinstitutionalization, which is, again, not a myth, right? But the narrative we have is that, oh, well, the failure to invest in alternatives meant that the jail and the prison would inevitably be the mental hospital of our time. And yet it's a much, much more complicated picture. There were a lot of investments, not maybe in the kind of community alternatives that people in the 50s and 60s were talking about, but in very real forms of mechanism. Finally, the point that Angel has raised about risk assessment. I've as much as anyone contributed to this image of risk assessment as a kind of deus ex machina, sort of colonizing the carceral state and other parts of the state. And yet, and we've always known, right, that parole agents override the algorithms and they fudge them in all these ways. But we've always treated that as a kind of aberration. The real story is the program, the way it's supposed to work, and the fact that it doesn't work that way hardly ever maybe is not caught our attention. And yet here, what is risk assessment a technology at all, or just a kind of a location for a certain act of creative manipulation of legal and other categories? Some of this reminded me of Mariana Valverde's important article a few years back, Sing Like a City. This tendency to see these kind of continuous arcs of confinement, great confinements, whether Foucault, Bourdieu, or others, James Scott, tends to be seen from the perspective of the state. And when you look at it from the state, it's easier to tell that kind of a story. But when you see like a county or a city, it's a very different picture, one that has plenty of oppression and plenty of power in it, but doesn't lend itself to these, in some ways, simplifying narratives. And of course, if you want to do that, then you have to do the kind of embedded ethnography that Armando has pulled off here. And I have to say, ever since my first job teaching at Michigan in the late 80s, and people like Nicholas Dirks were kind of inventing this kind of coming together of history and anthropology. And yet I have not seen this kind of embedded ethnography that takes two very specific parallel institutions in the same place and time, and does this, first of all, uses ethnography to define sort of relevant governmental techniques to study that just wouldn't be visible if all we had to go on were official statistics or rhetoric, right? You had to go into the emergency room, you had to go into the jail to first see these things. And then you had to go into the archives to make sense of how they came out of the complex politics that you described here. I'm struck again, as Angel was, by the importance of austerity in your story. And yet for me, to me, it's new in the sense that it seems to me the idea that austerity, right, is driving lots of the kinds of political choices we make, I associate more with discussions of Europe, discussions of the UK, and that certainly when we talk about the carceral state here, we tend to view it as like the Pentagon drawing on an endless source of resources. And yet austerity in its combination with legality turns out to be, from the county and maybe other parts of government, incredibly crucial. So let me get to the law part of this, because this is an incredible piece of legal sociology. And one of the things that's really counterintuitive having to me in reading it was many of us kind of work on the assumption that the politics of rights is something from the past, that sort of legal rights played an important role in the 60s and 70s. The politics of rights were central. And maybe that's true at the federal level, where more conservative federal courts at the appellate level have shut down some kinds of rights-based progress. But what you see here is that, those incredibly important lawsuits in the 80s and 90s established patterns that have, affected how LA governs from then on. We see the same thing in New York with homelessness, right? I mean, it was in the 80s that they decided you had a right to housing, but only if you were homeless. I mean, we don't think of the 80s as a period where we were creating rights, or that legal rights were playing a role in shaping politics. And it struck me that many of these rights are not unlike crime policy itself, in the sense that they're formed out of anecdotal, horrifying events, like the murder of those staff members in the LA County Emergency Room, that then becomes, it's like three strikes, right? We have this horrible event, then we write laws, in this case, rights-based laws, but we still, ones that may be very out of touch. I was struck here with the potential contrast with another influential Berkeley theory of how American law and politics works, and that's Robert Kagan's adversarial legalism. Whereas Kagan sees, American law as distinctive in kind of taking rights and turning it into a lawyer-governed system that takes problems out of the bureaucracy and puts them in courts. What we see here is that that's only part of the story, and that the other part of the story is very much frontline bureaucrats really controlling and manipulating the meaning of those legal categories in a way that isn't really lawyer-driven, although lawyers may come back into the story. Finally, and this is my last question for you as well, how much and this is, if it is, it's not a problem really, but it specifies it, should we treat this as somehow a uniquely LA story, right? And now, on the one hand, LA County is, as you point out, has a bigger budget than 37 of the states, right? So it is an incredibly important unit of government. But whether we think about LA or California as a whole, in which LA is the biggest moving part in terms of the carceral state, as Margot Schlanger, whose work you cite, has pointed out, California, and maybe LA in particular, has kind of a unique legal ecology. Lots of civil rights lawyers, lots of deep-pocketed liberals who are willing to fund efforts to use the courts in this way. So I imagine that in all kinds of other parts of the country, we may not have seen this kind of local-based legal right force kind of come into play here. So with that, I will again thank you for just a tremendous contribution to the social sciences, and so glad to have you as a colleague, and look forward to the discussion.
So now I'm going to return it to Armando, who has somehow 10 minutes to respond to all of this, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. So I want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A, and Armando, fire away.
We're scheduled till 2, Katie?
Till 2, yes.
Okay. Great. I'll try to be brief. Thank you guys so much for the close reading. You know, it's I've done these things myself, and it can be difficult to narrow one's thoughts for 10 minutes. So I really appreciate you guys doing that. You know, on Angeli's first question, which I actually read as it's a great question about sort of what's doing the action. So the people using the risk assessment tools, or the tools themselves kind of reshaping, reconfiguring the people. So it's kind of like at the boundaries of our sort of institutional embeddedness and performativity. And I obviously that conflict is or that disagreement between scholars is bigger than this book. And so I guess I would say in this book, it seems to me that the tools are being used very instrumentally by the actors to kind of solve immediate needs. And they continue to change when those needs change. So, like one big change is the need, sort of when the risk classification system sort of first arrives in the jail in the early 90s or late 80s, it's used to determine in-house safety. So like, how can we keep sort of people safely separated within the system? The administrators sort of over the next 10 years into early 2000s begin to use it as something to determine community safety, which is like a whole different vision of its purpose. And it begins to alter what attributes are included in what's considered an 8 versus considered a 7, right? That's a moving threshold. At one point I show excerpts where the sheriff officials are trying to convince the board of supervisors that there's a difference between serious murderers and less serious murderers. So like that kind of shift is going on in a way that I think is very instrumental, at least in this space. And I could see that happening as these kind of tools move into other spaces, right? That was a great point that you said about sort of their origin in jails. And then I'll connect this to something Jonathan said about this point. Sort of, I think in part we need to see these as legitimacy tools. They're not necessarily there to they're sort of kind of like public officials showing that they're doing something. We're being smarter. We're rationalizing something that was arbitrary before, even though we never admitted that it was arbitrary before. And sort of over time, they just keep doubling down on this. Like, okay, we implemented first step in the 90s, and in 2000s, we realized that it was still arbitrary. So we're going to pump more money into it. And now we have North Point here to show you this stamp of approval that we're kind of doing things correctly. And as Jonathan said, if somebody dies, well, or I think Angela said it, it's not our fault, it's North Point's fault. On this point about the sources of austerity, it's a great one. I think, I fell short of the Latourian charge to kind of trace everything back, keep going back. And that was where the book stopped, was kind of sort of the where sort of where it started, this kind of drive to austerity started in this case. As far back as I went is really, the big deal was the 1991 property tax shift under Governor Pete Wilson. I mean, basically, I mean, it's something we've kind of like many people have long forgotten, but it's what really made Prop 13 in 1978 real for county administrators. I mean, they basically slashed half of the property taxes that were under the control of California counties and put it into the state budget for education, basically. And then ever since then, there were like fights over sales taxes. And so Prop 172 was like the big one in the 90s, of sort of the voters approved a sales tax for law enforcement. It was probably the last one, as far as I know, that voters were willing to approve, the 3/4 majority. And basically, administrators funneled a lot of that money into health and welfare. They kind of didn't use the money for all of it for law enforcement. They basically manipulated what's it called, maintenance of effort budgeting. And then there were lots of lawsuits over that, and it eventually got settled. You know, the big fight that you see in LA County over the sheriff's budget is basically between the money allotted to patrol and the money allotted to the jail. And so the sheriff in the late 90s, I mean, so basically the the LA County Sheriff's Department is signing contracts with all these small cities in the county to be their police force. And they pay a lot of money, but the LA County Sheriff's Department has trouble hiring deputies because they like pay a lower rate. And so then they get accused of not putting enough resources into patrolling these suburban cities. And the only place to pull that from is the jail. So this shift, there's sort of a budgetary politics there of like sort of suburban communities demanding more protection. And to connect us to the point that Jonathan talked about, you know, that there's this kind of county level story of austerity that's bubbling in the 90s. And I see this as connected to the crisis that we see after 2008 and 2009 at the state level. I mean, it's kind of this long-term crisis that the state is interacting with. So for instance, in 2006, I mean, the way that the state of California dealt with legal challenges to its overcrowding was by sending Los Angeles County 4,000 inmates to kind of handle its own overcrowding, and the LA County sort of made a lot of money off that. They eventually send them back, which kind of precipitates a big part of the realignment that we saw in 2011. These are kind of like long-term crises that are shifting between different levels of the state. I see them as rather connected. The issue of you know, sort of opioids, and as you put it, Angela, is this great connection between sort of shorter term crisis and longer term ones, and if they're ever aware of the longer term ones, you know, yeah, the administrative decisions to allow nurse practitioners and others to administer opioids in triage, you know, that that was something that only doctors used to be able to do. And the practice came out of legal challenges. I mean, it came out of pressure, sort of CMS change. I mean, basically there was a CMS rule change in 2001 that sort of, it became a human rights issue that people needed different standards of care for pain alleviation. And they basically made, told hospitals, if you're gonna keep your CMS out, it's not necessarily accreditation, but you can think about it that way. You have to do this, otherwise you're not going to get our funding, and the federal government funding is where it's at. And so, that was one crisis. That was a short-term crisis of giving access to pain relief, and that was a good one, because in the sense that, like, medical practitioners have increasingly been aware that sort of the discriminatory practices of pain prescription at the point of discharge. And so sort of shifting that crisis over here was considered kind of a good thing. But as you were pointing out, I mean, it's in part, I mean, I don't know if anybody's actually proven this, but there's a longer term crisis that is probably coming out of this practice of emergency room giving, right? It's the crisis of the opioid epidemic. And I mean, that requires a science of addiction that I'm not necessarily privy to. Thinking about Jonathan's questions of these more spectacular moments of state violence that we're seeing in the news every day, and more quiet ones. I mean, this is kind of what I'm trying to push, this idea of the disappearing of crisis. So, and I'm developing this further in an article that that's conditionally accepted with the American Journal of Sociology right now, and it's about the cycles of these shorter term crises, kind of never sort of, the problem itself gets redescribed with each iteration. And it's really these spectacular moments that precipitate those crises. And I mean, that's what I'm talking about. So like right now, another person was shot in Minneapolis, right? And in Minnesota, excuse me. And there's going to be some redistribution going on around this problem. And as unfortunately, the legal challenges around this will get appeased through various kinds of redistribution. So I see these kind of shorter things eventually, these quieter ones are connected to more spectacular ones. I think I might be out of time there, so I'll leave it at that, KT.
Okay, so I think we have time for just maybe one or two questions. So I'm going to pick up on Becca Goldstein's question. So picking up on a thread of what Jonathan said, it's become popular to think of the criminal justice system as bloated and overfunded, and here it seems like you characterize it as threadbare, insufficient, and underfunded. This seems like a big and substantively crucial disagreement. Which is it? Are large urban jail systems insufficient and underfunded, and other parts of the systems are bloated and overfunded? And she says, thanks for that fascinating conversation. So
yeah. Great. Yeah, I think it's super critical. I mean, this is one of the dangers of publishing this in a book and presenting it here, is like to get rid of the nuance, and I think nuance is important here. So the issue is about scale. So these things grew, these jails like grew many times more than what was necessary during the 1980s. And the idea is that it kind of stopped growing, but that doesn't mean that they stopped. And so they stopped doing what they're doing, which is imprisoning way too many people. This is kind of like the way I would characterize it is sort of mass imprisonment has kind of created unforeseen problems that the state or the various agencies that make up the state aren't equipped to handle the fallout. And that fallout is way more expensive than anything required to build these institutions. And for good, I think good, the public has become less amenable to paying more and more taxes for this, the way that maybe a lot of baby boomers were during the 1980s.
We have one more question I want to squeeze in here, which is, you mentioned that austerity is a uniquely decentralized local phenomenon in the US. Now we have a public health crisis that both has a lot of local variation and has already caused medical scarcity, jail outbreaks, and local budget constraints. Do you see a bottom line at which medical provision could be filtered away from jails again? Or is that COVID-related austerity will cause a doubling down of the mechanisms you see?
Yeah, I think the COVID moment is another crisis that kind of is interacting with these existing ones. So, what's going on right now is basically state prisons, as far as I know, really didn't release anyone, during the crisis, but jails, at least at first, did. They released a lot of people. LA County prisons cut in 1 month from 17,000 inmates to 10,000. And they did this by not booking in people, basically. But, once the crisis kind of passed and attention waned, they filled right back up again. And I do think you're going to see claims from public administrators about the necessity of refunding these institutions. Like after 2001, in September 11th, California passed an emergency room, a sales tax for emergency room dollars, and the public was willing to fund that. And as anybody knows, it's very hard to raise taxes here, but they did it, and because there was a feeling of crisis and necessity. So I do think we'll see claims from hospitals to do this. And I do think we'll see claims from jails about the need to expand medical funding within them. But I want to point something out here. It's not all like a kind of negative story. Like social movements are like onto this. So like, they're smart and they have smart people involved in figuring out what to do. And as the abolition movement has opposed the medicalizing of jails. Sort of don't build jail hospitals, don't build jails at all. I mean, so the 2015 decision to turn the central jail in Los Angeles into a hospital was a major decision, but by 5 years later, the social movements have basically shut that down because they're onto it. And the administrators had, sort of they're kind of at a loss of what to do because they need the space. But and sort of, I think similar stories happen in San Francisco.
Well, with apologies to those of you still on the queue, we have reached the end of our program for today. I want to thank Armando and the panelists for a terrific event. And I hope to see you all back at either a Matrix or a Center for the Study of Law and Society, or both events soon. So thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you, everyone.
And buy Armando's book.
Thank you.